We struggle with all the time in the military with legacy versus relevancy. And there is this trend in the military to pay homage to our history and the things that we do. And this is a legacy task. And this is stuff that we've done because of our forefathers. But every so often it does benefit from looking at, is it still a relevant question? Is it still a relevant task? Is it still a relevant task? I was in the Fort Bragg area when they revamped the Special Forces qualification course, and you would have thought the entire world was burning down. And I think there's some value in it. I don't know what actually happened with what the changes were, but I thought it was valid because they were saying, hey, the way that we selected a Special Forces soldier in Vietnam may not be the way that we're selecting the Special Forces soldier for 2020 or whatever year it was. And I think there's a lot of things that can be learned from that, but I'll tell you, change is hard. Especially organizational change and wide scale change. People are always going to fight it, but I think it's made easier if you can explain the why, if you can talk about the relevancy of the test that you're using or the questions you're asking with those tests, and then put the systems in place to affect that change.
Welcome back, Leg Tech Nation. We got a very insightful, deep conversation for you today. Drew, who are we talking to?
Well, if you've listened for any length of time, this will be a warm, familiar voice for you. This is this friend of the pod.
And first repeat guest,
Chris McNamara. We had him on some time ago talking about assessments and some of our thoughts around that. So as we mentioned in that episode, Chris comes from deep within the bowels of U.S. Special Operations. He's also a coach of athletes. So he brings a lot of experience to the table. And basically, we just wanted to pick apart a lot of the thought traps that we see people fall into in the human performance industry.
We're a classy podcast, so it's all about the thought traps, not the thirst traps. So what we're going to dive into, and some of this is ground we've covered in previous episodes, so you will hear a couple terms redefined and things like that, but they bear repeating, honestly. These are common kind of misconceptions or misinterpretations of things. Some of our favorite ones that you've definitely heard of before are Goodhart's law and the McNamara fallacy. We're going to layer a couple more on here and have a conversation about the ways they impact how we approach designing, not really designing physical training programs, but mostly like evaluating physical training programs and creating policy around them.
And it's an episode that we've talked about doing with Chris amongst the three of us for a long time, because really the goal or the hope is that in listening to this and kind of putting a name to a face, so to speak, for some of these logical fallacies, the challenge is to recognize if in your own, whether you're an athlete or a coach or just a provider in general, whether in your own practice, these types of, well, like Alex said, these thought traps, these biases rear their heads. And so today's episode is all about, we're talking about thinking about thinking.
And Chris is so guilty of one of them that they even named it after him. So he's the perfect person to talk about it.
Exactly. Enjoy.
Rules of engagement. 5 things, biases, fallacies. One of them has Chris's last name, not related to Chris at all. Roughly 10 minutes per, unless we just totally go off the rails and talk about 1 or 2 things for an hour, like whatever works. But you, as the person with the pen and the paper boarding pass upon which you've taken notes, will be the referee, and we will just go.
Okay. So we should probably start it by laying the groundwork. And we've talked about this in previous episodes, but I think it bears repeating. It's a good theme. It's the whole point of the platform, just explaining the whole idea of MOPs and MOEs and what the heck it has to do with fitness. I know we have a decent contingent of nerdy field grade officers who listen to this podcast, and they're all definitely going to be familiar because it's from joint doctrine, Joint Pub 3.0, and it's in some Army publications and things like that. And they probably have to study it at War College kind of nonsense. But definitions of terms, measures of performance, and measures of effectiveness. Measures of performance is, are we doing things right? Are we completing the tasks that have been assigned? measures of effectiveness is, are we doing the right things? Are the tasks we chose to do actually getting us closer to the end state we want? And I don't think anybody has like laid out a more engaging version of this than Mark Taysom, who introduced it to me. But the way I always use it, you ask any given audience of Army people or military people, it works in pretty much any audience, honestly. You ask them, how do you know if a workout was good? And consistently, the answer you're going to get is, did it make you sore? Did it make you tired? And did it make you sweat? All right, cool. If those are the criteria for a good workout, then meet me in the sauna at 2 a.m, and I'll punch you in the face. You're going to be sore because you just got punched in the face. You're going to be tired because it's the middle of the night, and you're going to be sweaty because you're in a sauna. Clearly, that has not gotten you any kind of productive results in terms of your fitness. So you completed the task right of, if the intent was we just need to make you tired, sore, and sweaty, you did it. And you did it in seconds. So why is that not working? It's because you haven't figured out what your goal is. And you haven't figured out whether you're getting closer to it. So that's, I think, kind of the groundwork of why is this called MOPs and MOEs, and why do we need to change the way we think about how we make humans fitter? Because we're doing some stuff that is not necessarily guided by any particular end state.
I think the example that comes to my mind is, you hear this a lot in conversations around aerobic training, where everything is based off of heart rate. And so then the corollary to that is it zone 2 training if you're just sitting there watching a scary movie and your heart rate is high? Because if we just stick to the performance metrics, which would be the heart rate zones, then by definition, yes. However, we all know that that is not an effective like aerobic session. So I think, and this is relevant because we're literally talking about this right now during my government civilian ed course. Shout out government civilian ed course. I think I know people trend more towards measures of performance because it's the easy button a lot of times, and measures of effectiveness is oftentimes much harder, requires either subjective components, which we'll talk about in some of these biases and fallacies. But it can also involve interpretation of data, and that can be a bridge too far for some people. And I'll stop there before I ramble.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add in is where I've seen this go wrong in the military in the past is, improperly defined goals or objectives. I think we've all kind of seen that, but also treating this as a fixed thing, right? Like as a static thing, when we all know, specifically with humans and specifically with goals, and as we go over time, it's dynamic and it changes over time. And so if we're not reevaluating these things, you can, I think all of these things, and I'll be the first one to admit I've fallen into the trap of some of these biases and some of these logic faults that we're going to talk about today. But just knowing like, okay, time and place and starting from a framework, cool. But understanding that, if we're going to measure true effectiveness and that's over time, it's not a fixed thing. And you don't ever get it. You don't ever win fitness. It's an infinite game.
Can you have, I'm kind of thinking out loud here. When is a MOP, a measure of performance, the better of the two? And when is a MO?
Well, I think part of it is there's not a battle over like which is better. You have to have both, right? Because like understanding what your goal is fine if you're not like doing now we're like blurring perform like the two together.
I was going to jump in and say the same thing, Alex, which is, I think that both are necessary. But the relevancy of both will switch based on kind of what you're trying to do. If we are getting someone ready for a fixed gait, bringing it back to military fitness, an ACFT, a gait within a state or community, well, okay, yeah, we can be a little bit more objective and we can look true measures of performance. But when we're looking at longevity, career applications of doing their job at a high level for a long time, there's some effectiveness in there and some other things that aren't as tangible, aren't as objective, aren't as quantifiable that absolutely matter.
Well, it's like if you just hang your hat on the MOP side of equations, you can, hey, the guy's back squat went up. Hey, his mile time went down. Hey, whatever. And if that may though very well be an ineffective approach if we don't consider like, well, now his sleep is trash, now his stress is high, now yada yada. So I don't really know where I'm going with that other than to say, I think the correct answer, like you guys have mentioned, is that you do have to have both, and you can't so very easily just look at the performance metric without considering whether or not something is effective, because they both kind of inform each other. I think I just
They
haven't really
absolutely
unpacked
do.
that enough.
They absolutely do. And I think part of it is like, we're not trying to say stop measuring performance. You should definitely keep doing that. You just have to kind of constantly
incomplete.
remind yourself. Yeah, you have to constantly remind yourself whether the thing you're looking at is the actual goal or just a proxy that's like easier to look at and easier to track and things like that. Like, are you measuring strength, or are you measuring 1 rep max deadlift? Because 1 rep max deadlift is like a version, like it's a proxy for strength. It's a way we have to measure it, but it's not the task relevant strength that you're necessarily looking for. Just as like you brought up heart rate is a proxy for like cardiovascular load, but there's lots of other ways that your heart rate could be elevated because of exposure to heat. Heart rate could be elevated because of some like psychological stuff that's going on.
Snort pre-workout.
Yeah. Like if I jump out and scare somebody and their heart rate goes up, I didn't just give them a workout. Like that's not how it works. It's a decent proxy, but you can trick it in a variety of ways.
Yeah. And when I, think of this, at least in the performance realm, I don't know how many of our military listeners, like, Paula Radcliffe's story, I think you guys kind of know it, how if we just measured performance over her history, and like for the listeners, that's one of the best female marathoners of all time, world record holder at one point. Like when they looked at her VO2 max, and this is published, like her VO2 max declined over time, her sit and reach flexibility test declined over time, and those were her world record marathons. So if we were just measuring objective measures of performance without looking at true effectiveness and is she winning races, we would have got that wrong just chasing data. And I've seen that go wrong in many, many areas, because we'll get into this. What you can measure isn't always what you should be looking at. And she was winning, but arguably some of her objective stuff was going the wrong direction. But there was no account in there for running economy and things of that nature. So I think that's one on the performance side that always sticks out in my head when I hear both of those. Okay, she's winning at the cost of some VO2 max changes and flexibility. And here's what I'll say in the military space, maybe sometimes giving up VO2 max and other things, good thing, maybe other points in a career, higher PT scores, maybe not what we're chasing.
Yeah, I love the Paula Radcliffe study and the Paula Radcliffe story. And I know we'll touch on this with some of the other ones that we're going to go through, but I think it's an incredibly important point, especially in the tactical human performance space, because you could very well show that these arbitrary performance metrics are improving. And in some cases, I don't want to say that individual may become less effective at their job, because they may still be a fine soldier, but you do have situations where performance is increasing arbitrarily based on whatever gym metric, and they may not be the most efficient or most effective guy when they go out to hack the mish.
Yep. And that's where I think, let's not put it all on either strength staff or performance staffs or anything else. Like I think the military in itself has done a poor job of defining operational needs and some of these other things, right? Like no one has ever been able to tell me in 20 plus years what a VO2 max for a special operations soldier needs to be. I don't think we know that. I don't think we need to, but yet when we flip that around, people will test those things and say, oh, we need to improve your VO2 max. We need to improve your relative strength, absolute strength, arbitrarily on both ends.
The right answer is it's whatever Chris's is. That's what everyone else's should be.
I've been saying it, Drew.
Just setting the bar.
Thank you. There we go.
The bar setter.
I like that, like without even meaning to, we've kind of touched on like at least two of the topics we're going to be getting to.
What's the next one?
There's possibly three. So I think the easy next one, and actually let's skip. I'm gonna change the order on the fly here because I think it's relevant to like what we just talked about. But I think and because we've got Chris here, we can make it name relevant. But the McNamara fallacy.
This one's all Chris's fault.
Yeah, you want me to dive into it? My namesake here. I'll say, I'll just jump in. I've heard this since I've come in the military, just because of the same name, and distilled down to the simplest level is basically saying that just because you can measure something doesn't mean it's worth measuring. And specifically, Secretary McNamara in the Vietnam War was famous for measuring body counts. Like body counts was the thing. And what that led into was a misrepresentation of success in Vietnam and a misrepresentation of success in certain battles and other things. So people would chase body counts with no regard of what was going on in the total war. So yeah, I've heard that a number of times, and I will say, owning it, there's some times in my coaching career that I've also fallen prey to that, right? Chasing numbers with myself or with athletes that in the big picture didn't matter. In the moment, they seemed like they did. So guilty as charged, both in name and following into that bias myself.
I think there's a flip side to this too. And I was thinking about this just a few minutes ago. I hadn't really put the pieces together until now, but really when I had created the MOPs MOEs and started having conversations, I didn't really have the language to understand that this was a McNamara fallacy issue. But I was talking about has the ACFT had a good effect or a bad effect on the Army, or no effect or whatever. And having walked around units that had started training for it and implementing things that way, I could see that there was, just by the nature of the events on the test, you had people falling into coaching roles and talking to soldiers about movement quality and how they move. And I was confident that I was seeing an improvement at a population level in movement quality. And a guy came back at me with movement quality, that sounds made up. I don't really know how we would measure it. Must not be important, must not be real. Right. And that's the reverse of the, it's part of the McNamara fallacy, but it just because you can quantify it does not mean it's important. But just because something is hard to measure doesn't mean it's not important as well. Right. Something might resist ready quantification, or it might be very subjective, or whatever it is. That doesn't make it not important. And there's the military case of that is when you're talking about a Vietnam, or honestly, if you're talking about an Afghanistan, the end state is a little bit fuzzy in terms of what does getting closer to stable governance look like, or what does getting closer to an independent security apparatus look like. And that is hard to quantify. It is hard to measure. It's extremely important. So I don't know.
I think we should let's take a step back, because the McNamara fallacy, it's also called the quantitative fallacy. So we touched on the body count military approach, which makes a lot of sense, but just to give the full scope of what this actually is, it's when your decision making is based strictly off of quantitative metrics, i.e. things you can measure. And the flip side then is that you ignore quantitative metrics, i.e. things that are a little more squishy. Qualitative, things that are a little bit more squishy, things that you can't necessarily measure. So to Chris's point about body counts, that's something that's measurable. You don't include anything that's qualitative in that discussion. So it's similar to, I think, the MOPs and MOEs piece that we just talked about, but specific to, again, the military human performance side of the equation. I think when I think about where military human performance is going, especially on the conventional side, this is almost one of the most important things to keep in mind, because when we talk about the cognitive enhancement domain, when we talk about sleep, when we talk about relationships, these are all mostly qualitative things. And people have tried to create surveys around stuff and have tried to create quantitative data and, make it very clean and put it into a spreadsheet. But just ask the chaplain corps. We talked about this when we had Chaplain Chris on board. It's very difficult to quantitatively measure some of these things. And if that's the only metric that you care about, then you run a massive risk of just completely missing the boat. In our case, specifically on soldier welfare. And I think we talked about this, maybe it was when we had Remy on. I know we've talked about this before, where whether it's the Air Force, Army, Navy, pick your branch, soldiers are treated like vehicles, where you've got maintenance charts and red, yellow, green, and blah, 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 blah. That's kind of an example of a potential McNamara fallacy, because you fall into the trap of, if it's not measurable objectively and translatable into a spreadsheet or a PowerPoint, it doesn't matter. Over.
Well, I'll stretch that to something else, and you guys can disagree with me on this potentially, but I think part of the trap we fall into, and this is as we're getting into the interdisciplinary health, wellness, fitness stuff, as we're trying to broaden this thing out and make it more holistic. I think that the physical domain obviously gets the most attention, right? Because it's the easiest, it's the most obvious. But I think, frankly, that's just because it's the most superficial of the components of like fitness and health and wellness because of that quantitative versus qualitative thing. I think if you start to dig into the research and find that those like squishier or fuzzier pieces, when you start to talk about like Drew mentioned relationships and sleep, but also as you talk about like mindset and spirituality kind of stuff and all that, I would point people towards some of Ellen Langer's research. She's the one I think Stanford, but the most well known of her research is the housekeeper study, where they talked to housekeepers about how the things they were doing seemed to look like exercise, and suddenly, without changing their behavior at all, they got fitter. Their blood pressure went down, their body composition improved, they got stronger, everything changed without any change in their daily activity, just a change in how they think about their daily activity. But it's really hard to quantify mindset. Like it's very hard to like graph how good people's mindset is and say, like, oh, you improved your mindset by 10% this month. I don't know what that is. So we tend to ignore it a little bit. And that applies to lots of other, like the harder it is to quantify, the less attention we give it because of McNamara fallacy kind of stuff. But that doesn't mean those domains are any less important or impactful. I would argue that in a lot of cases, those things are more important and more impactful. I just don't know how we like convince people to care, even if we can't put it on a graph.
Well, so I think there's two things here. I think there's a trap and then there's some opportunity, right? So we can fall into the trap of measuring what we can measure, pick a quantifier, VO2 max. And then we can talk about relevancy and transference and these other things and kind of disprove it, but it's a measurable thing. And if we're being honest, we live in a commander's world where they want to see something. So sometimes, we have to quantify things because they want to see it. But I think someone who can truly look into those things and say, okay, man hours lost because of, injury or illness or whatever else, you can use data to your advantage in that realm, but it may not be, hey boss, our ACFT scores or our average is higher, but everyone is coming to work more. There's less man hours lost. There's other things. So if we're going to quantify something, asking better questions and quantifying the right thing, I think is an opportunity, not necessarily a trap. And then I think the other part is a little intellectual honesty on the performance side and saying like some of these things purely are just because we can measure them, they don't matter. I do think it takes a little bit of humility saying like, hey, one, I don't need to measure that and don't do it. But also to say, hey, that we just don't know what to do some of this, because the other part is just measuring one thing is also a trap. I think we all know that all the variables that go into humans is where the magic really lies. Like an ACFT is a data point. Sleep and these other things are data points. When we tie them all together, we see the trend. So I think that's where we can use some of the numbers to our advantage. I'll be honest with you, I don't know anybody that's doing it perfectly, but I think there is hope for it as we go along, and machine learning and some of these other things that can help us see trends we can't even see right now are emerging.
Yeah, there's probably a Goldilocks component to this whole thing of like measuring enough things. You don't want to measure nothing. Like there is utility to measuring and tracking things, but like we can easily fall into the trap of treating service members like guinea pigs, where we're coming at them with like a different survey for everything we're trying to figure out a way to quantify. And at the end of the day, that just creates people who don't care about the surveys, and all the data is useless anyway.
I feel like we're infringing upon the Goodhart's law.
We're doing some successful but unplanned transitions.
That was either the most inadvertent, brilliant transition of all time, or
Yep.
I accidentally cut you off and transitioned you.
No, I think that was perfect.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So I define MOPs and MOEs. Chris defined McNamara. Do you want to define Goodhart?
Yes, I will. So Goodhart's law in summary, and I know this is something we've talked about before. As soon as you start to measure something, it ceases to be a good metric.
Or like the slight rewording that I like the best is that when the metric becomes the goal, it ceases to be a good metric.
Yep. And that's what I was kind of hinting at with some of those with the body count, and then kind of a segue into the stuff we were saying, because then people, to steal what Alex has talked about a couple of times, which is people can train for the test if we're talking about a physical test, but I think it also incentivizes some things that may not be healthy. If we start to make a measure, put it on a pedestal more than others, right? And what I mean by that is in my world, there's never it's always best of the best with honors, right? So when we put a score up, people want to beat that, sometimes at the fault of their own tissue tolerance or, immune system function or other things. And you can extrapolate that across different other things outside of fitness. But it doesn't become a good measure anymore. And so I think that's where, if we ask the right questions or ask better questions with data and cross-validate both subjective and objective things that we're talking about earlier, questionnaires with true performance numbers, sleep ratings with performance, these other things will protect us from that, but it's really hard to do at scale.
And I think I referenced like the Goldilocks phenomenon earlier, but one that comes to mind on this one, when you talk about like putting certain things on a pedestal can end up being harmful, but there's interesting data. I think I saw it from Army Health Center, might have been somewhere else, but unlike some other events where like the better you get at them, the better your outcomes health wise are, things like that. The deadlift shows like a bimodal thing where the weakest deadlifters have like higher injury rates, then somewhere in the middle is the lowest injury rates, and then the biggest, like the heaviest deadlifters start to trend upward again on their injury rates. And there's lots of things that could confound that. Like you're probably going to have larger individuals crushing the highest deadlifts, and you may be running into like just impact from those larger individuals doing high impact activities. There's lots of reasons. It's probably not just, it wasn't the extra 5 pounds they put on their deadlift 1 rep max that made them more susceptible to injury necessarily. But we see phenomenons like that in a few places where if you take anything to the extreme, and like some people may have looked at like the illness, wellness, fitness continuum kind of thing, there is an argument that like when you go too far in the fitness direction, you can sacrifice health to a certain degree. Like professional athletes are not the healthiest individuals. Many of them after retirement experience like extremely negative detrimental effects of what they put their body through to achieve those really high levels of performance. We got to be careful about how much we focus only, and I think most commonly, on physical domain things to the detriment of more well-rounded health and fitness.
Well, the ACFT is a good, like, as soon as you have a test and create a test, people will only train for that test. And then the whole quest of determining what right looks like goes out the door, because they're only going to do what they're getting tested upon. So by definition, it becomes a bad metric, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I had a good conversation about training with the test. This was like a couple of years ago, even. I don't know if Pat listens to the podcast, but Pat, if you're out there,
shout out Pat.
But he's a military guy, but like was involved in a gym off base. That gym experienced a lot of demand for like ACFT kind of classes from service members who wanted to like learn the test and like learn how to do better on it. So he agreed to like run some classes for the gym to help people prepare for the ACFT. And what he found really quickly is that if squatting was in the workout, they would get mad because it's supposed to be deadlifting because that's what's on the test. Or if like assault bike was in the workout, they would get mad because running or rowing is what's on the test. There's no assault bike event on the test. Like, or if he did pull-ups on the workout, they'd get mad because it's supposed to be a leg tuck. That's what's on the test. RIP. But I think like people are like so myopically focused on training for the test that they can't even like comprehend the idea of like training the component of fitness that the test is assessing. So they will take it to the point where the only strength work they do is hex bar deadlift. And the only upper body work they do is hand release push-ups. Like it gets ridiculous when you take it that far, and it almost makes it harmful because now you've like removed all variability from your training and it's no longer measuring what it was supposed to measure. You're just practicing the actual events.
Didn't you? I don't want to throw him under the bus, so I won't name names because he's very, very high ranking. And I hope, Alex, you know who I'm talking about when I say this, because I believe you used him as a reference at one point, and his style of working out was to take whatever event he was not good at and just hammer. I mean, you tell a story.
Yeah,
He was hammering.
I'll assume some risk on this one. I will lay this one out here as like we're gonna throw down the gauntlet and say that if he wants to like challenge this or have this conversation, he's extremely welcome on the podcast if he wants to have it. So the guy you're talking to about is the Sergeant Major of the Army, Sergeant Major Grinston.
Hello.
He came and I did a workout with us a while back, and he wanted to know how to improve on his own ACFT because he'd been working really hard in ACFT. When he first took it, he kind of struggled. He passed, he was fine, but like he didn't achieve what he wanted to. And so he worked really hard on it, and he got to the point where he was maxing most of the test. He was doing really well. But what he had not really improved in was his standing power throw. He just didn't really know what to do. And we had like one of my NCOs like pulls out a whiteboard and starts drawing like force velocity curve on it. And like we clearly lose him immediately because he was not interested in the force velocity curve conversation. So we distilled it down and tried to make it simpler to figure out like what kind of training was he currently doing to try and get better at it. And he explained that all of his workouts, and this is probably for decades at this point, right? He found a system that worked for him and just stuck with it. But all of his workouts were the same. He picked whatever event he was going to work on for that day. And every workout started with like a 4 or 5 mile run. And then he would do a 20-minute EMOM, a 20-minute of every minute on the minute with whatever event he was working on. So if it's going to deadlift day, he's going to run for 4 miles, and then he's going to do deadlifts every minute on the minute for 20 minutes. If it's hand release push-ups, he's going to run for 5 miles, and then he's going to do hand release push-ups every minute on the minute for 20 minutes. And that's not super optimal for a lot of things, but it's okay. And like not going to be terrible if you're like working on kind of like muscular endurance or like maybe building a strength base. It's like it's probably not the way I would program stuff. It's probably not the way you guys would program stuff, but it's not the worst thing in the world. But what it's definitely not good for is improving like speed and power kind of stuff. You're pre-fatiguing yourself, and then you're doing super high volume with super low rest times. It's not going to make you more explosive. Like we have literature on like ways to train for more explosiveness, and it requires a high enough intensity that you have to be providing a decent period of rest, and you probably don't want to pre-fatigue with a 4 or 5 mile run. And so like we said some of that stuff to him, and he's like, oh, I'm not really going to change the way I train because I've been doing this forever.
We could bring this example up again for one of the things we'll talk about.
This will bleed into our next topic, but we're not quite there yet. I think we got to finish hashing out Goodhart.
Yeah, no, not there yet, because it's actually a great example.
It is. We're just coming up with some killer segues, man. But I like it was so explicit in terms of like he was just going to do the things on the test in this particular framework and not stop to like figure out whether he was developing the components of fitness that the test was looking for in the first place.
Well, I think about it too from a programming standpoint as you're talking, because like in my early days as a strength coach, and even still some like when it's necessary, you'll program specific days where athletes are going to test a metric, like, hey, we're going to do your 1 rep max or whatever. And there's goodness in that because you get a number that you can then train off of. But I would argue that there is some of this Goodhart's law present in the sense that they then get super hyped up on that particular day. There's a whole lot of stuff that surrounds the fact that it's a test day. And then all of a sudden you have to ask the question of, did we really effectively test performance here? Or did the athlete just physically, mentally, whatever, train for this particular session? And so with that in mind, a lot of times now what I'll do if I'm interested in teasing out some sort of performance metric somewhere and not necessarily tell them, hey, this is going to be a testing day, or this, we're going to do a 1 rep max, we're going to do a baseline week, whatever you want to call it. But that to me is kind of similar to what the Sergeant Major was doing, where you're basically just testing yourself all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some opportunity here, especially for like H2F staff, coach staffs everywhere. There's a little bit of education there. Like you don't get better for the SAT by taking the SAT over and over and over again. And so, there's some ways you can actually empower them through education and say like, okay, you suck on the math portion. Let's break down your math and keep the other stuff normal. I think there's also, my background in the medical world, like when we talk about, sensitivity and specificity of testing and these other things, and the broader the test, the more you lose some individual aspect of it. And what I mean by that is like take heart rate, take blood pressure. If I take someone's heart rate or blood pressure and it's not perfectly 120 over 80 or 80 to 100 beats per minute, depending on where they're at in life, that's not wrong. Those are points to start with. So I think if we're talking about Goodhart's law, we got to ask first, like, what is a good measure and what are the things we're trying to drive from that? Because I think there's some, what Alex was hitting on earlier, like there are some things that will drive change by using something like the ACFT. People are only training for the ACFT. Well, unfortunately, that's what they're going to do because their career and their livelihood depends on that thing and their promotion and other stuff. So unless we change that system, which I have ideas, we're not going to fix it too much, but I would argue it's better than them just training for push-ups, sit-ups, run until you puke. So, there's some value in that. As I look at it, if the test can have some transference to their job, it will drive positive change in their training, tying in the H2F staff. I think it's a win-win all around, but I think there's some bigger systemic issues, at least with the ACFT. I think the trap, though, is right now, it's the only test we have. You guys heard me say it last time. I got a ton of questions about it. I think we should have a battery of tests. And it's like, you don't know which one's coming this month. Whatever command authority is putting that one out. And if you've been training push-ups, sit-ups, 2-mile run, and you've got a trap bar deadlift and a rope climb, whoops.
Shout out episode, whatever number it was. Chris.
As we've been talking, I keep thinking we should like rehash the testing thing, but we do have a whole episode on that. So I would encourage people to go back and listen to it. But I'm imagining everybody's like showing up for the PT test morning of, and the commander's like rolling one of those like bingo things where all the balls are rolling around in it with like different test events and just like spinning it and like a ball comes out and that's how you find out what event you're testing that day. Like
you're literally talking about the first CrossFit games and some people are going to get so triggered that you just did that, which is fine. It's just going to happen.
One caveat with my idea, they should get 30 days. You get 30 days because if you practice the skill of rope,
that's fair.
The fitness aspect should always be high.
But then don't you run we're going to
segue right now. We going this way?
No. We're going to thought experiment this because it's valid. So let's say you have 30 days. Let's say I am the commanding officer of the two of you, which is interesting because I was never in the military. Hey guys, 30 days from now, I'm turning the little hopper. We're going to do X, Y, and Z. Do you guys not think that the majority of people will then only do X, Y, and Z for the next 30 days? And you're looking at overtraining injuries, you're looking at overuse injuries. That's just me being devil's advocate because I could see that going horribly wrong.
No, I don't think it's the hopper thing. I think it's you publish the test 30 days out. And sure, if they want to do that, great. But then the next test 30 days from that is another polar opposite end of the fitness spectrum.
That's fair. For more on testing, go see our earlier episode with Chris McNamara.
I don't know. I think I was trying so hard not to bite on the survivorship thing when you were talking about the CSMs piece. I don't know if you guys were ready for that, but
I think it's the natural transition.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, define it. What is survivorship bias?
Survivorship bias is kind of looking at a population or a person or a group of people who make it through an event and only looking at and copying what they did instead of looking at others who did not make it and changing systems because of that. I think the biggest analogy that a lot of us have heard before is like World War II aircraft. They'd go on a bombing run.
Yeah.
The ones that would come back, they would analyze and say, oh, you didn't get shot here, here, and here. That must be where to put more armor, when it was actually the inverse. The ones that didn't make it back is where they should reinforce the armor because that's the ones that got shot down. And so I think what you just explained is it. You have the CSM of the Army talking about what he does. I guarantee you he was a young, fit, motivated individual. I guarantee you he's always been on the higher end of the fitness scale. And for him to transition to something like this, even at whatever age he is, it's a little bit of an outlier. And if that is what you're looking at, that could be a thought trap. I think the same thing is, and I'll own this in a lot of the soft realm is like, oh, what those guys did, they got into that area. It's a trap because some of those guys came from different athletic backgrounds. They approached things differently. And what got them through may not work for everyone. So I'm much more of the individualized and kind of specific approach based off people's limiters. But that's the survivorship bias, I think, in a nutshell.
Here in the DoD and like the Army in particular, I think we run a pretty effective meat grinder of we will have people, not even because of combat, just because of like the way we've trained them, medically retiring in their 20s or like early 30s, because we have like successfully produced a system that wears people down. And some people come into the meat grinder very resilient. And they can tolerate that suffering and even improve because of it. Because like anything you threw at them would have probably made them better because they are robust and resilient enough individuals.
part of that is genetic, part of that is the way they grew up and the foundation they had when they arrived and how physical they were, whatever. But the trap is those people, because of their ability to survive the meat grinder and persist for long durations, rise to the top. And so they say, well, like, you're clearly doing it wrong. It was fine for me. We should apply it to everyone else. And we see this all over the place. It's not just a military thing. It's consistent everywhere else. But like, I mean, like there's certainly a pro sport one, right? Like people get to a certain level as professional athletes. Like I've heard from coaches lots of times, like you shouldn't look at Olympians for good training, because many Olympians are Olympians in spite of some of the training they're doing. They're doing crazy stuff. They just happen to have the genetic and early childhood stuff in place where they were gonna dominate regardless. You're looking at an N of 1. You don't know if that training is what made them so capable, or if that training is just something they do for whatever odd reason, and they happen to be able to tolerate it effectively.
But I think all these have overlap, because if we're applying Goodhart's law and saying, well, the measure is the Olympics, well, or pro sport, right? That's what a lot of the military idolizes. I don't quite understand, but they idolize the pro sport world. Like, well, that must be a good thing. And then what numbers did they have to get there? What kind of fast feet drills did they get to run faster, and all these other things that don't necessarily transfer to what they need? And then it gets into this, and we didn't put this one as our talk, but something I've seen as of late, I think it's called overconfidence bias or transference bias, or something's like, hey, if I'm good at one thing, I'm good at a lot of other things. I'm a Navy SEAL, so I should be your financial advisor, sort of thing. And on this one,
I should write a book.
You should. So, sorry to my Navy SEAL brethren, I got shout out. But really what I think this turns into is, you got some really good people who are really good at certain things, and they'll tell their story, but they get the microphone or they get the spotlight because they survived. They didn't necessarily, we didn't look at the ones who got weeded out. We didn't look at the ones who didn't make it and say, hey, could we have made them better? Could we have done some upstream things to get them through? And so that's just a different approach to these processes, I think.
Well, you see it, and you guys have both touched on this already, so I'm rehashing a little bit, but specific to strength and conditioning, I would argue that like most, if not all, of this industry is propped up on survivorship bias. I mean, when you read any of the Soviet texts, any of the Chinese, especially like in the Olympic lifting, I do Bulgarian, I do Chinese, I do those systems, and what you're seeing and what's being broadcasted to you are literally the result of the people that survived to get to that point. Like Prilipin's chart that everyone knows and loves, and I'm doing this many reps at this percentage because Prilipin said so. Like those weightlifters were the ones that literally survived that meat grinder, and those systems at the time were set up so that from childhood onward, if you didn't make the cut, you were done. And so when we think about, hey, this program works great for this population, well, like the Olympian example you guys touched on, like for that one guy that made it as a result of this thing that you're now paying $10.99 a month for, how many untold thousands of others did it not work for? And so I think the mark of a good coach is the ability to recognize the positive feedback loop that gets created by being surrounded constantly by athletes that do well in your system, and looking at the ones that maybe don't do well and figuring out why, and then adjusting. Because really, if you're a good coach, you should be able to adapt to just about any type of athlete, not just the ones that survive your particular approach.
I think it's funny. Another term for survivorship bias is selection bias, right? And if we're talking about soft communities and other things, it's always stuck out to me for that exact reason. Like, okay, who survived selection? Let's copy what they did, not taking into account anything else they did. Like maybe take a look at their physical training, but not their athletic history, training history, all the things they did for sleep, recovery, nutrition. But it's a trap, right? And then so we just keep repeating that regardless of the individual stepping into the meat grinder, to use Alex's term earlier. And so then it just becomes this process. Now, here's what I'll say is, like, as a coach and owning it, like I fell into that early on, right? Like Prilipin's chart, some of the things that you said. And I think those are decent starting points. With my background in medicine, Like, I will tell you that there were times with dosings of certain drugs or certain things that was the starting point. And then the term titrate to effect comes in, which is you dial the dose into what the patient needs. The other part, austere medicine in the special operations world, is sometimes they only have certain medicines. So textbook answer might be a certain thing, but it was my job to apply what I had in the moment based on what the patient was presenting with and make it work. And I think that is that's paying homage to some of the H2F staff that's out there with no equipment, with limited resources, and they're doing dang good work. And so that's where I think there's so much potential there, but we have to be aware of this bias so we don't start copying and pasting, and we don't get into this trap of, well, I don't have all those fancy things and I don't have all the barbells, but you can still elicit an adaptation if you know what you're looking for and know how to apply that stimulus.
The one that's coming to mind for me, and this is like oddly specific, but it's what your conversation's been reminding me of, is I remember this must have been a couple of years ago, but like talking about Olympic stuff. I was like reading about this particular Olympic figure skating coach, and you see only like the celebration on TV of like the athlete that makes it through and does some like really incredible stuff, and it's absolutely mind-boggling. But if you dig into that athlete's coach a little bit, you find that they have like a trail, literally a trail of broken high potential children behind them, where like these people were like offered up as this could be the next Olympic caliber athlete. And they trained the absolute shit out of them until they broke. And then they forgot about them because they're not going to be the next Olympian because they're broken. Like we're talking like teenagers with destroyed backs who will like never be able to have an athletic career anymore because they were like trained to the breaking point. And yet like none of that stuff makes it on TV. None of that stuff makes it into the conversation. And it's probably not figure skating for most people, but a lot of people are going to look to those elite professional athletes, those Olympic level athletes, and be like, how's that person training? I should train like that. Not without the context for it of how many people who trained like that are left broken on the side of the road somewhere, once upon a time having tremendous potential, but not quite enough potential to reach the absolute stratosphere of their sport, and are now kind of used up and don't get to pursue any of that because they're left to the side. Like, not to mention, you're going to try and apply it without any coaches to tell you whether you're headed in the right direction or not. Like, nobody to guide you. You're just going to copy paste what you see people at the elite level doing. And there absolutely is a trap there. I don't know how we like, I think it's just a matter of like talking about it and making sure people realize that like what people at the elite level are doing is not necessarily how you would get yourself closer to that elite level.
Yeah. For context, just Google, and I forget his name, the Norwegian speed skater,
Niels van der Poel.
Yeah. Who literally published his entire training plan and was like, here you go, look at it. Like, you want to get a glimpse of what that looks like, but not only the X's and O's, because I think that's what people are drawn towards, but from a survivorship bias standpoint, look at everything else that went into supporting that in terms of the time required, like the nutrition that he had to have, the sleep, the recovery, et cetera, et cetera. Like, it's a mass. I mean, it's his entire life. And he won gold, rightfully so. But I think you're right. People will see what's being done at the top and they'll seek it out, not really thinking about, for every one that makes it, again, there's hundreds, potentially thousands of people that would not have made it had you done the exact same thing.
And that's where I think, some of the ownership here, we've been talking a lot about staff, H2F staff and coaches and things like that. But there is some individual ownership here in terms of, not copying Niels van der Poel's training.
Don't copy it.
Will win gold, right?
You don't have time.
So, yeah, you don't. Dedication. But I think some of that is it's a coping mechanism for people stepping into a very big deal. Like, take someone going to a selection event for, special operations field. Like, there's a lot of uncertainty there. And so they can get a little bit of a cognitive bump, take some of that away. Like, well, if I copy what they did, then I'll be okay. But there's, on that end, there's some individual ownership saying like, hey, you have to check in and trend the right way. So if they're not just following their numbers, not following these same logical traps, there's a way to protect themselves from it. And it's a little bit, I don't know, I guess harsh to say, but some people are going to get broken on the same plan that you try to do, but that's okay. Like, change your plan. Doesn't mean that you're inferior or anything else. And the flip side of that is if you do have a staff, like an H2F staff, a coaching staff, hopefully they can tailor that for you and take the guesswork out of it.
Love it. Number 5.
We didn't come up with a nice, smooth transition for this one, did we?
I don't know. I'm just saying, if you're trying to copy what's always been done,
That's
before,
good.
That's
Ooh.
fair. That's
Chris
fair.
swooping back in with the transition.
There it is.
Chris, what an excellent transition. Alex, what should we talk about next?
you might be falling into dependency, which is the next thing you're talking about.
So since Chris did a fantastic job teeing it up, Drew, do you want to define path dependency? Because you're the one who loves to nerd out about this.
I do love to nerd out about this. And again, I think it's not unfortunate, but just by virtue of the fact that this is the 5th and final one, you'll hear a lot of similarities to some of the other things that we talked about. But path dependency, I will describe it through an example, which is basically, if you look at the keyboard, this is the common example people talk about with path dependency, and the QWERTY keyboard specifically. The reason why the keys are arranged that way is because when we had typewriters, people were typing fast enough to jam the machine and cause issues. So they literally laid the keys out in the most inefficient way possible to slow people down. And we've just never changed it. And so path dependency is effectively saying that things are done a certain way because they've always been done that way, and just essentially leaving it at that. It's one of my favorite things to talk about, especially when I'm trying to trigger people in my profession of strength and conditioning, because a lot of the reason why coaches do things does not go any deeper than the answer of, well, it's always been done that way. That's infuriating to me, especially, and we've talked about this a lot on this podcast, trying to create a tactical athlete paradigm requires that in some places you do things differently than they've always been done, specifically because you're dealing with a new type of athlete. So that's how I would define it, / also how I would like soapbox about it.
And the critical component, I think, in terms of like keeping path dependency in mind as you're thinking about problem sets, is like know the history that led to the way things are now, and occasionally take the time to revisit components of that and like think through like, hey, like the reasons they were doing it that way, do they still apply? Or the science that they base that argument on, is it still considered valid? And I don't think that's a hard thing to do sometimes, because it like we got to where we are based on generally valid reasons, but there might have been a step in that path, coming back to like why it's called path dependency. There might have been steps in that path that were taken based on particular components of the context at the time that no longer hold true today. And that's where you have to go back and sometimes revisit those things and be willing to challenge the way things are.
Like, here's an example. And, Chris and I, big golfers, play golf together every couple of weeks. The reason why there's 18 holes is because that's how much room was available at St. Andrews when they first built that golf course. Like, people say it's from, oh, there's that many shots and whiskey. Like, no. It's because that's how much space they had. Another example, railways are as wide as they are because in the 1800s, that's just the width that they chose. And that type of thing is interesting because you think about how much like technological development that has driven, how much just like cultural stagnation that's driven, just in terms of like, well, I guess we're just going to make trains that wide because that's what they are. Like, no one ever thought, well, maybe we could do it differently. But again, tying it back to human performance, it's like, well, we're going to bench press on Monday because that's International Chest Day, I guess.
You're gonna get me all upset about a topic that has nothing to do with fitness or tactical.
Railways.
Yeah, trains in America suck. And like, you go to so many other countries and
I was
trains
kidding,
are
but I'm
amazing.
glad you went down that road or went down that rail.
You're triggered right now. Oh my God.
Someone
I'm
just
with you,
showed
though.
like a
I'm with you.
comparison map of like how long it would take to go by rail from like Chicago to New York compared to the same distance like anywhere in Europe or Asia between any two equivalently major cities. And we're talking like it takes well over quadruple the time here. Like, our system is just very, very bad.
Dude, I lived in Tucson for a long time, and there was a train from Tucson to San Diego, which by car is like 6 to 8 hours. I think it was 24 hours. by
Yeah.
train. But when I lived in the UK, no one has a car because you take the train everywhere. We're getting, you're going to love this pun. We're getting totally derailed talking about.
I'll jump back in to bring it back around because I've only ridden a train in Norway. So that's all I got.
Oh, I went to Norway.
Never in the US though. I got no US correlations. But what I was gonna say is some of the stuff we were talking about, we struggle with all the time in the military with legacy versus relevancy. And there is this trend in the military to pay homage to our history and the things that we do, and this is a legacy task, and this is stuff that we've done because of our forefathers. But every so often it does benefit from looking at, is it still a relevant question? Is it still a relevant task? Is it still a relevant task? I was in the Fort Bragg area when they revamped the Special Forces qualification course, and you would have thought the entire world was burning down. And I think there's some value in it. I don't know what actually happened with what the changes were, but I thought it was valid because they were saying, hey, the way that we selected a Special Forces soldier in Vietnam may not be the way that we're selecting the Special Forces soldier for 2020 or whatever year it was. And I think there's a lot of things that can be learned from that, but I'll tell you, change is hard, especially organizational change and wide scale change. People are always going to fight it, but I think it's made easier if you can explain the why, if you can talk about the relevancy of the test that you're using or the questions you're asking with those tests, and then put the systems in place to affect that change.
And it's important to note that this is not like a wholesale argument against anything that is traditional, right? Because there are lots of things that are traditional that survive a relook at it. I remember I got a little frustrated when I was watching like some of the early days of the conflict going on right now in Ukraine, because I went to a fair number of NTC rotations and I did not necessarily enjoy the whole experience very much. And I know how expensive they are and how much time they take and things like that. But I tell you what, like Russia's performance in Ukraine, like so many of those things are because they don't do the equivalent of RCTCs. They don't test their systems to that degree to find out, like, yeah, maybe you have the right number of soldiers and the right number of tanks and all those things, but you don't have the systems in place to get them to the place they need to be with the things they need to have to actually perform effectively. So like, do CTC rotations kind of suck for a lot of people and take a lot of time? Yeah, they sure do. And they're expensive. But could I see, as events were playing out in Ukraine, why something like an exercise of that scale is necessary to flex all the systems that are involved in making large scale deployments happen? Yeah. So like that is the way we've done it for a long time. And it might seem like it's just tradition and might be dumb. And like from certain people's foxholes, it probably looks like it a lot because like any given infantryman at NTC might never even fire his weapon over the course of the entire thing. So it can seem dumb, but like there are reasons for some of those things. So, and I know that wasn't a fitness example, but it's one that came to mind.
Pat, like you mentioned, history itself does not necessarily equate to inefficiency. I think there's a lot to be gained from tradition and kind of looking backwards. But I think where the harm and path dependency bias can come from is that you find that you are not critically analyzing whatever it is that you're doing. So if you do that analysis and you discover, hey, this is actually the best way in light of emerging information and modern this, that, and the other, then okay, great, carry on. But I think the challenge to people, listening, coaching, riding trains in Norway versus the United States, it's just to kind of take a step back, evaluate your practices or your approach to whatever the problem set is that you're dealing with, and subject it to kind of the devil's advocate point of view. And if you realize, hey, maybe the fact that A, S, D, F, G, H, J, K, L, I'm looking at a keyboard, I didn't just come up with that off the top of my head. Like the fact that those are all next to each other, maybe that's not the most efficient way. Maybe we should change it. I don't know.
I think the flip, like the coaching other extreme, and I've seen this happen a bunch of times, is like people will go and get like a new certification or go to a course that like exposes them to a new thing and immediately wonder, how do I have to change all of the way I coach to incorporate this new thing I just discovered? I don't think that's the answer either. Like you don't have to like completely overhaul your whole system every time you learn one new thing or one new tool. It should just kind of go into this like library of possibilities that are there. And if through your analysis, you find that you need a tool that is new or different, that's when you can pull out of that library and apply it.
I did that when I first met Kelly Starrett. I started picking things up like super differently for about a week, and then I forgot about it. But for a week, I was probably a total jerk to be around. Like protect your spine.
I think there's two things there. So, I mean, you know, in the assessment selection world in the military, we talk about standards creep. So everybody wants to add a new standard, and over time, enough of those 1 or 2 degree declinations or changes in the azimuth get you completely backwards. So I think there is some value in watching, like protecting for that. But at the same time, like I think there's also the trap that we kind of hinted on. I don't think we put it in the specific talks for this about Dunning-Kruger, to where like, hey, you get that response to something, you're like, I know it all. I'm the king of everything, right? I remember specifically graduating some of my medical courses early on, and they're pretty in depth and high failure rate and all those other things. So you get this overconfidence effect, aka Dunning-Kruger. And the longer you do it, the more you realize, like, I don't know anything. And I think that applies to any field. But I think we're getting into that some here, to where we don't want standards to creep, and so there is some value in legacy things and protective mechanisms, but we also don't want people coming back from a new course and thinking they know it all and throwing everything out just because they got a new idea.
I think I'll quickly, so like I found a McNamara element in Dunning-Kruger that I'll explain in a second, but I think it's worth defining the thing before we keep rolling. And you'll often see Dunning-Kruger depicted as a graph. I highly recommend, if you're listening to this and you don't know what Dunning-Kruger is, you just Google it, because you will find a classic graph that shows, like, it starts with the peak of Mount Stupid, which is where you've learned like just enough to become dangerous. And then you drop from the peak of Mount Stupid into the valley of despair, where you start to get enough perspective to realize how much you don't know. And then you think you'll never be able to figure it out. And then you slowly climb the slope of enlightenment gradually over time afterwards. And sometimes that can be a repeating cycle. But one thing I found really interesting, and this is where like Dunning-Kruger ties into McNamara, is there have been many attempts to quantitatively research and like prove, quote unquote, the Dunning-Kruger phenomenon, and they have generally failed. They've not been able to produce like a quantifiable model of Dunning-Kruger. Yet, as you talk to people, they can articulate how it applies to their own life. They've seen it happen in other people. Like it rings true to a lot of people in like a qualitative, my experience sense. We just haven't been able to quantify it. So does that mean that Dunning-Kruger isn't real because we can't quantify it? I don't know. I think there's enough evidence from people's like broad spectrums of experience to say there's a phenomenon like that occurs. It comes back to like, not everything that is quantifiable is necessarily the most important, and not everything that isn't quantifiable isn't important. But
well, it gets into the whole, and I mean, this could open up an entirely new podcast. I don't want to do that, but it gets into the whole idea of like biopsychosocial model of human behavior, human performance, whatever you want to call it. But in case anyone wasn't tracking, like medicine, all of these big areas that we think about in the past couple of years, decades, whatever, have trended away from strictly biomedical, which you could argue is very objective, very quantifiable. Humans are machines, inputs equal outputs, et cetera, to biopsychosocial. The challenge being kind of like what we talked about at the beginning of the episode. How do you then now quantify or measure, or do we even change what we think of when we say the word measure and quantify? Like, how do you quantify some of these things? How do you take account of some of these things? Hans Selye is another one we've talked about, where like stress adaptation, whatever, but maybe there's a psychological happening that kicks that off. And then how do we capture that and then account for it? Like, you know, I'll talk about John Kiley. Like, he talks about this in some of his writing. Dunning-Kruger is a good example of it, but all the things that we've talked about leading up to this, I think at least contribute to that conversation around, once you add a psychosocial element to the conversation, you almost have to reframe what you think of when you look to go and measure stuff in the first place, because you're going to miss a whole ton of things that lead to whatever that end result is that you're looking at in the first place.
Yeah, I completely agree, Drew. And I think that's the hidden piece. Alex kind of mentioned it earlier. Like, how do you quantify that? How do you show that to a commander during a command and staff? Some other things, but we're hearing it from all different realms of the military with like behavioral health issues, spouse abuse, suicides, pick a thing. And there's overlap. And then I do think there's one other piece here that I've seen it go kind of wrong with. I don't know what the term is, whether it's overconfidence or like expertise faults from other fields. Like, hey, I've done this with pro athletes, therefore it will work with soldiers. Because the social and the psychosocial aspect is different, right? I'm going to war with these people. I live with them. There's the off season is different. There's entirely different social dynamic of what war is about. And the physical fitness piece is just one aspect.
I think that is probably the biggest struggle coaches have coming into this space is accounting for that side of it, and maybe taking for granted in a professional environment, in a collegiate environment, you do have a lot of control over those variables, and you don't in this case. And so it does introduce, I mean, would that be path dependency? I don't know if it's probably all of the above, really.
Well, I think there's a whole conversation to be had of like, how do we embrace those variables, even if they're not like what's taught in like lesson number 1 or the first textbook you ever opened? Because I like the stuff that's coming to mind. Like you said, this could be a whole separate episode. We're not going to go too far down the rabbit hole, but there's like the placebo effect, but not just the placebo effect. There's a nocebo effect where we can take things that do work, and if we convince you to not believe in them, they will stop working.
Pain science.
But there's, yeah, like I know we've talked about like we want to do an episode on pain. There's so much out there in terms of like figuring out what that, like how you think about things and whether that impacts it. I think one thing I was talking about it at work today, right? I think we do a huge disservice to service members by convincing them that health and fitness are things that they do for their job. And we also, in many cases, simultaneously convince them that like exercise has to suck and be unpleasant. And what that results in is the world we have today, where like the average person who separates from the military gains like 30 to 40 pounds in the first year or two after separation. That's astonishing. And it's because they can't wait to be freed of the shackles of having to be fit and healthy. Right. But like so many of us would think that like fitness and health are things we do for ourselves and we should intrinsically value those. I think we harm people by forgetting about the psychosocial component and focusing just on the, I can make you exercise enough that you'll like achieve the metrics we need you to. And I don't have to think about how you feel about it or what's going on here. I think we're like having a realization that that's not necessarily the case.
I think that there's path dependency in that, because you also have to think about how, and I'm formulating this idea as I talk it. So if it makes no sense, I apologize, but we tend to romanticize the past. And I think especially specific to strength coaches, we romanticize this idea of the, you know, chasing Olympic gold, Soviet this, American that, Chinese this, not taking into account that the reality of the fact, the military we're dealing with now, the culture we're dealing with now, we talked about this with Dan a little bit as well, Dan Bornstein, you do have to account for more of the emotional state of the athlete that you're working with, because that's now come to the forefront when we think of mental health. And we think about how, I mean, look at Gabby Douglas in the Olympics, like taking a step back for mental, like that's a huge component of training now. And if you're not accounting for that because you're just sticking to models that worked in a world where that may have been squelched, again, I think you run the risk of doing some serious damage. Sounds bad, but like you do run the risk of doing damage.
I think there's two things that come to mind with that, Drew, and that's one, we can't, you know, there's a saying that generals always fight the last war, like they're shaped by what their history was coming up. And then the other one is like the curse of knowledge, meaning like, you know, us sitting here right now are like, oh, you know, I can't believe my kid believes in Santa Claus. Like we can't see things in the way that they do because we've lost that through our own knowledge. And I think so there's some things here where, you know, we forget what it's like to be an initial entry soldier. Well, Drew's never lived that life. Those things and trying to force that's ready to go do the nation's bidding on whatever that may be, but also trying to create buy-in with those guys and get it. And I think, you know, Alex, you said it a couple of times. I've seen organizations that are very successful without doing PT at 6 a.m. Without negatively incentivizing fitness and health and performance, which then positively incentivizes, I'll say negatively incentivizes fitness, and then that incentivizes other coping mechanisms that aren't healthy once they get out, versus a focus on longevity and health over a lifespan, not just a career span.
Well, here, let's put a bow on this. We've discussed 5. Alex, what were the 5?
We laid out the concept of MOPs and MOEs. We talked about Goodhart's law. We talked about McNamara's fallacy. We talked about survivorship bias. We talked about path dependency, and we got a bonus rep talking about
Extra credit, baby.
Dunning-Kruger effect.
Extra credit.
So I think really the reason why because the 3 of us have been texting back and forth about this for a while, and the reason why we wanted to put this out is to, one, true to the title of the episode, think about thinking. Because I think if you're not thinking about your own thought process, you're kind of missing the boat a little bit. But two, I think for all of those fallacies, because they are all related, there's a lot of crossover, and that was intentional. The idea is that you need to constantly be challenging your own belief system, not in a critical, well, relative, not in a self-critical way, but in a productively critical way, such that what's the why behind the thing that I'm doing, whatever that thing is. If it's, what's the why behind programming squats this day, or what's the why behind the reason I talk to my athletes this way, or whatever. Like, that's why we wanted to put this out, to sort of get the conversation going around the sort of cognitive fabric that underlies the decision-making processes in human performance. That's my bow.
Perfect.
Did we miss anything?
No, I think we opened a lot of doors for future conversations, but I think we did a good job of laying out the thought traps, so to speak, that we wanted to do for this particular episode that we've seen come up in a ton of conversations, particularly conversations surrounding fitness, health, wellness, and in particular doing that in a tactical context.
See, most fitness people post thirst traps. We post thought traps. And that's what we're about. Episode over.